All right, so we're going to start the next slideshow with Reconstruction. I'm going to go over President Andrew Johnson, Mends the Union. So this cartoon shows President Johnson mending a coat in a tailor shop. That's where they did things back in the day. The sign on the wall says A. Johnson, a tailor. That's someone who mends. Okay. So the person on the left, right here, okay, what is he waiting for? Okay. What's he waiting for? Is he waiting for the coat? Yeah, probably. So Uncle Sam, this is Uncle Sam, he's waiting for Andrew Johnson, okay, to mend this coat back together. Coat says Virginia, New York, Ohio, South Carolina, Illinois, Pennsylvania. I can't read that one, but this is basically, the coat is the United States. Andrew Johnson's the president. He's trying to mend it back together. This represents the reunited nation, which had been torn apart by civil war. Sections of the coat are labeled with the names of the states, both Union and Confederate. The cartoon displays a positive attitude about Johnson. Why? Because he's actually trying to mend the country back together through Reconstruction. And Uncle Sam is smiling, and President Johnson looks confident in the photo. So the question is, a framed page with the heading Orders and the name of Jeff Davis hangs on the wall behind Johnson. What do you think this might represent right here? Okay, orders. Jefferson Davis. Okay, who was Jefferson Davis? He was the president of the Confederacy. Okay, so Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, has placed an order for a certain kind of Reconstruction plan that will, quote unquote, suit the southern states. You know, what do you think? Why this is what we call a political cartoon. Okay. This showed up in newspapers back in the day. We still have political cartoons today, and basically they're one big giant puzzle. You have to have knowledge to figure these out, and they're all over the place. So, President Johnson, Uncle Sam, the code is the United States. All right. This cartoon is an Andrew Johnson supporter because he's the person who wrote it. Is actually Andrew Johnson's trying to mend the United States back together. However, this up in here, remember, Johnson's Reconstruction plan was not as cutting edge, if you will, to get the South to go along with everybody else, all right, to fix the slavery issue or the racist issue in the South. So this is all what this political cartoon is about. But it is pro Andrew Johnson, which Andrew Johnson actually was impeached, okay, for his views. He didn't want freedmen or freed African Americans to be able to vote and all those sorts of things. So he got impeached by radical Republicans, but he did not get convicted. All right, so let's go to the notes, okay? Let's say another difficulty facing the new Republican governments was the different groups within the Republican Party in the South often had conflicting goals. Remember, Republicans wanted the abolishment of slavery. Okay, and we have scallywags. That's this word right here. Okay, it's a name for a white Southern Republican who were small farmers. Okay, and they opposed the South seceding from the North, from the country. Many former Southern Confederates were bitter about losing the war and unhappy about the changes taking place in Washington. These were Southern Democrats, but there were Republicans in the South. Not every Southerner agreed with slavery or the war. White Democratic Southerners believed them to be the traitors and called them scallywags. A scallywag is a Scottish term for a scrawny cattle. Scallywags mostly consisted of Southerners who originally opposed secession and of small farmers who resented the large plantations. The small farmers wanted to improve their economic and political position and to prevent the former wealthy planters from regaining power. So, another term, carpetbaggers. These should be written in your notes, by the way. Carpetbaggers were some Northerners came to the South in order to help former Union soldiers, black Northerners, Freedmen's Bureau officials, teachers, businessmen, clergy's people with the church, and political leaders. Southerners didn't like the quote-unquote Yankees in their land, and they depicted these people as greedy men seeking to grab power or make a fast buck. Some Northerners did go south to make money, but not the majority. These people came to be known by Southerners as carpetbaggers. It was an insulting name, and it was named after a cheap suitcase made from carpet scraps. Slide 3, the birth of the New South. Okay, imagine making $1.75 to $2 a day. That's what you would have made if you were working for the railroad in the mid-1800s. Now imagine this. Okay, imagine this. How about 50 cents a day in the sun for 15 hours a day? That was one of the few employment options for African Americans in the South. Okay, we just fought the Civil War because of slavery, all right? And the slaves picked cotton for the plantation owners. Imagine doing the same thing. Fought the Civil War, it's over during Reconstruction. Freedmen were going to go pick cotton for 50 cents a day, 15 hours in the baking, blazing sun. And females only got 9 cents a day. Okay. Not very cool. So, we had farming changes. Without their own land, freed African Americans could not grow crops to sell or feed to their families. Economic necessity thus forced many former slaves to sign labor contracts with planters. In exchange for the wages, housing, and food, freedmen worked in the fields. Although the Freedmen's Bureau promoted this wage labor system, the arrangement did not satisfy either freedmen or planters. On the one hand, freedmen thought that the wages were too low and that white employers had too much control over them. On the other hand, planters often lacked sufficient cash to pay workers. These conditions led planters and laborers to experiment with two alternative arrangements: sharecropping and tenant farming. Sharecropping, it was in this system of sharecropping, landowners divided their land and gave each worker, either freed African American or poor white, a few acres along with credit for seed and tools. At harvest time, each worker gave a share of his crop, usually half, to the landowner. This share paid the owner back and ended the arrangement until it was renewed the following year. They worked under supervision and under the threat of harsh punishment. They could be fined for missing a single workday. After the harvest, some dishonest planters simply evicted the sharecroppers without pay. Others charged the families for housing and other expenses, so that the sharecroppers often wound up in debt at the end of the year. Since they could not leave before paying the debt, these sharecroppers were trapped on the plantation. Sounds a lot like slavery. So the other one was tenant farming. If a sharecropper saved enough money, he might try tenant farming. Like sharecroppers, tenant farmers did not own the land they farmed. Unlike sharecroppers, tenant farmers paid to rent the land, like renting an apartment. Tenants chose what they wanted to plant and when to work. They had higher social status than sharecroppers. All right, next slide. Cities and industry. Some Southerners who visited the North after the Civil War were amazed at how industrial the North had become. The production of war supplies turned small factories into big industries. Industrialization had produced a new class of wage earners. It had ignited city growth and generated wealth. Some Southern leaders saw a new opportunity for the South. They wanted to rebuild the South, not just agriculturally, like pre-Civil War times, but build a new industrialized South. They were calling for a, quote, new South. A major focus of Reconstruction and one of the greatest success was rebuilding an extension of the Southern railroads. By 1872, Southern railroads completely were rebuilt. Around 3,300 miles of new track were laid, a 40% increase. Railroads turned southern villages into towns and towns into cities where businesses and trade could flourish. Commerce and population rose not only in Atlanta, but also in Richmond, Nashville, Memphis, Louisville, Little Rock, Montgomery, and Charlotte. So we'll talk about funding Reconstruction. The rebuilding of the infrastructure, road, bridges, canals, railroads, telegraphs, etc., and a public school system added $130 billion in Southern debt. Falling cotton prices and mounting planters' debts also caused many banks to fail. The massive growth in the South caused an influx of large amounts of money and corruption. The worst cases of fraud involved the railroads. A crooked businessman might bribe a key state senator to win a government contract or bid for construction of a new railroad. The businessman would often then collect the construction money, use it for personal investments or even a vacation, then declare bankruptcy. In this way, numerous railroads were never built, and millions of dollars wasted to rebuild the South disappeared. In South Carolina, the legislature even gave $1,000 to the Speaker of the House to cover his loss on a horse race. Many people were involved: blacks, whites, Republicans, Democrats, Southerners, Northerners, and carpetbaggers. Reconstruction became a symbol for corruption. So, President Grant and corruption. So, corruption even reached the White House. President Grant was considered an honest man. However, he had no political experience before becoming president and found it difficult to believe that others might use him for their own political advantage. When making political appointments, he often selected friends and acquaintances rather than people with proven ability. Too frequently, Grant's appointees turned out to be dishonest. Early in Grant's second term, a scandal emerged involving the Credit Mobilier Company. Credit Mobilier had been set up by the owners of the Union Pacific Railroad to build their portion of the Transcontinental Railroad westward from Omaha. The Union Pacific gave the Credit Mobilier enormous sums of federal money. While some of this money paid for work, much of it went into the pockets of Union Pacific officers and politicians who were bribed into ignoring the fraud. This became known as the Credit Mobilier Affair. All right, the end of Reconstruction. We'll talk about the first American-born terrorist group, the Ku Klux Klan. In 1866, what had started out to be a social club in Tennessee became a terrorist group in the South. It was the Ku Klux Klan. The goal, quote, to defend the social and political superiority, unquote, of whites against what they called the aggressions of inferior race. By 1868, the Klan existed in nearly every southern state. Its overreaching goal was to restore white supremacy. Its method was to prevent African Americans from exercising their political rights. Between 1868 and 1871, the Klan and other secret groups killed thousands of men, women, and children and burned schools, churches, and property. While the vast majority of victims were African American, whites who tried to help African Americans, whether by educating them, renting land to them, or buying their crops, were also in danger. Another Klan objective was to turn the Republicans, who had established the Reconstruction governments, out of power. The North Carolina State Senator John Stevens, a white Republican, answered warnings that his life was in danger by saying that some 3,000 African American voters had supported him at the risk of persecution and starvation, and that he would not abandon them. Stevens was assassinated in 1870. While Klan members tried to conceal their identities, when they struck, Southern Democrats openly used violence to intimidate Republicans before the 1875 state election in Mississippi. Democrats rioted and attacked Republican leaders and prominent African Americans. Their terrorist campaign frightened the African American majority away from the polls, and white Democratic candidates swept the election. The Democrats used similar tactics to win the 1876 elections in Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana.
a shadowland of secret clubs and societies began to take shape. In Mississippi, the White Liners. In Louisiana, the Knights of the White Camellia. And across the South, the Ku Klux Klan.
If you grow up in a society and where for centuries you have been taught that other people are your racial inferiors, it's very hard to accept the enormous social change involved in their emancipation. Any benefit that accrued to blackness was interpreted as a loss of whiteness. Education, the acquisition of property, was viewed as somehow unnatural.
Ku Klux Klan does not see itself as lawlessness, but as the law. Because they do not believe that black men deserve political power or know what to do with it once they have it, they think that it's their right, maybe even their Christian responsibility, to destroy black political power before it has a chance to become too entrenched.
Abram Colby had been elected to the Georgia legislature, along with Tunis Campbell. The Democrats wanted to curb his power in the county. They tried bribes, but Colby turned them away. In October of 1869, the Klan set out to teach him a lesson.
They were the mercenary forces of the Democrats who were trying to regain power. They were not simply using the ballot because they felt they would lose at the ballot box. They were using violent coercion. They were eliminating their competitors.
Colby's attackers could not hide behind their hoods.
Some of them were the first-class men in our town. One is a lawyer, one a doctor, and some are farmers. I knew the voices of those men as well as I know my own.
They would take people out of their houses or their cabins in the dark of the night, strip them out in a road, make them run down the road, make them sometimes lie on a rock where they would be whipped, where men would line up to whip them. Sometimes they would burn parts of their bodies. These were sadistic tortures.
They said to me, "Do you think you will ever vote another damned radical ticket?" I said, if there was an election tomorrow, I would vote the radical ticket. They set in and whipped me 1,000 licks more.
This was a war of terror. The Ku Klux Klan, organized in 1867, is an original American terrorist organization.
Okay. It's the federal response to the Ku Klux Klan. So to curtail Klan violence and democratic intimidation, Congress passed a series of enforcement acts in 1870 and 1871. One act provided for the federal supervision of elections in southern states. Another act gave the president the power to use federal troops in areas where the Klan was active. However, President Grant was not aggressive in his use of the power given to him by the enforcement acts. And in 1882, the Supreme Court ruled that the 1871 Enforcement Act was unconstitutional. Although federal enforcement of anti-Klan legislation was limited, it did contribute to a decrease in the Klan's activities in the late 1870s. However, the reason for the reduction in Klan violence was the Klan's own success. By 1880, terrorist groups had managed to restore white supremacy throughout the South. The Klan no longer needed such organized activity to limit political and civil rights of most African Americans.
State your age, where you were born, and where you now live.
I am 52 years old. I was born in Greene County, and it is my home now, when I can live there.
In October 1871, 2 years after the attack that nearly cost him his life, Abram Colby testified before a congressional committee. His back had been badly injured, and he had lost the use of his left hand. But he'd gone back to the Georgia legislature, and he continued to campaign against Klan violence.
No man can make a free speech in my county. I do not believe it can be done anywhere in Georgia. If you go there, you will be killed or shot at or whipped or run off.
The growing number of attacks like the one on Colby had finally prompted a federal investigation. Hundreds of witnesses risked their lives to tell their stories. Northerners who cared little about the fate of blacks in the South were horrified by the accounts in the newspapers.
It really reveals to the country the extent of these kind of atrocities and terrorism in the South.
Grant realizes we've got to stop this. We can't just allow everything that we're trying to accomplish to be destroyed by the flagrant acts of these white vigilantes in the South.
Grant understood that the memories of war, North and South, were still raw, and felt he couldn't risk full-scale intervention. He could, however, set an example in one state, South Carolina, where Klan terror was at its bloodiest. In the fall of 1871, he declared martial law. Scores of suspected Klan leaders were rounded up and tried in federal courts.
It's infuriating to white Southerners that they would come in, impose this national power in their own homes, doubt their word, solicit the testimony of former slaves. This is something that would just insult white Southerners more than anything that had been done up to this point.
Prosecutors had destroyed the Klan in South Carolina. Grant's crackdown had brought a measure of peace for the time being.